I'm Suzanne Akbari. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second webinar in the Ethiopian Studies series hosted by the Institute for Advanced Study. This series is co-convened by Aaron Butts, Samantha Kelly, Zabina Schmidtke, and myself, with the technical assistance of Maria Tuya. Our first webinar on the Beta Israel and Ethiopian Christian views of Jews and Judaism took place on the 17th of November, and it was a great success. Recordings of those talks by Stephen Kaplan, Sophia Deg-Müller, Aaron Butts, and Marcia Kupfer can be found on the IIS webpage for this series. Today's webinar is the first of two on the topic, The Turn to the Medieval in Ethiopian Studies, The Turn to Ethiopia in Medieval Studies. Samantha Kelly will be introducing today's event, and the follow-up to this will take place exactly 1 month from today on March 17th, featuring talks by Alessandro Bausi, Farina Krebs, Ayub Durillo, and Samantha Kelly. Samantha will be moderating today's panel. She is professor of history at Rutgers University and member this year at the Institute for Advanced Studies School of Historical Studies, where she's writing a book on Ethiopian and European collaborations during the 16th century. Let me conclude with a couple of housekeeping remarks. Please note that this session, like the previous one, will be recorded. We'll have time for questions at the end, but please do put your questions in the chat, and you can do this at any time, including during the talks. Finally, let me encourage you to come to the future webinars in this series, the follow-up to today's session that will take place on the 19th of March, and also the fourth webinar, which will be called Beyond Ethiopia, the Islamic Intellectual History of the Horn of Africa, which will take place on May 14th. Thank you again for coming. Sorry for the kerfluffle at the beginning, and let me turn this over to Samantha.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And also thanks to my other co-organizers, Aaron and Sabina. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. As some of you may know, we're having a big snowstorm here in the Northeast. It's not quite as bad as Texas, but obviously we're having technical problems. So our subject today and in the following webinar, as you know, is the intersection of medieval studies and Ethiopian studies, two fields with different regional concentrations and historical formations that nevertheless share areas of inquiry with comparative potential and also have points of contact and entanglement. Especially with the rise of the global Middle Ages as a rubric in which to examine contemporaneous developments on a broad geographical canvas, we're interested in these webinars in interrogating the possibilities and the drawbacks of this intersection from multiple perspectives. So from different disciplines, in terms of different applications, and in light of the orientations potentially brought by training in different contexts. In the interests of not taking up too much time, we didn't have a flyer that gave bios of all of our speakers, so I'm just going to give you a little bit more of background on each of our four speakers. I'll introduce all four of them at the beginning, and then we'll just go straight into the talks. Our first speaker, Dr. Andrea Myers-Achi, specializes in late antique and Byzantine art, manuscript studies, and late Roman ceramics. Since joining the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2018 as assistant curator, she has co-curated the exhibitions Art and Peoples of Karga Oasis and Crossroads, Power and Piety. Her current projects include exploring translations of Byzantine art and culture by local and foreign artists working in Africa from the 4th through the 15th centuries, and curating medieval Northeast African art through the lens of critical race theory. Dr. Achi is also an archaeological ceramicist and has been involved with numerous excavations in Egypt and Italy. She will be speaking today on where does Byzantium fit in the turn to the medieval and Ethiopian studies. Our second speaker is Marie-Laure Durat, a research director at the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS, and a specialist of Christian Ethiopia from the 10th to the 15th century. She's the author of two influential historical monographs, one on the relationship between monasticism and the royal power in the early Solomonic period, Le Domaine des Rois, and another on the earlier so-called Zagwe rulers, L'énigme d'une dynastie sainte et usurpatrice, as well as articles on a wide array of subjects, from plague to slavery to royal ritual. She also leads the historical and archaeological mission on the site of Lalibela, a collective volume on which she published with Claire Bosc-Thiessé in 2019, and has long been working on another such mission at Mariam Nasrat in Tikrai. She will talk to us today about Ethiopian medieval history between connection and isolation. Our third speaker, Dr. Kristen Windmiller-Luna, is the curator of African arts at the Cleveland Museum of Art, a first-generation college student who focuses on mentoring future museum professionals. Her curatorial work centers on collaboration, community building, and critically engaging museum practices. Recent exhibitions include Threads Across Time, African Textiles from 500 to 1993, in Stories from Storage at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and at the Brooklyn Museum, African Arts Global Conversations of 2020, and One, Egungun from 2019. With Dr. Achi, she'll also be co-curating an upcoming exhibition that considers links between Northeastern Africa and Byzantium. Her research on historical and contemporary African arts focuses on Ethiopia and has been published and presented in African, American, and European outlets. Her talk today is, Where is Ethiopia in African art history? The canon making and canon breaking of a discipline. Our fourth speaker is Feliga Salam Solomon Yirga, an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. His research deals with the cultural, social, and intellectual history of the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea regions in late antiquity, with interests in historiography, hagiography, and memory. He also studies the Aksumite and medieval periods of Ethiopian history, and particularly the reception of late antique texts in Ethiopia and their role in reconstructing the indigenous memory of Aksum in medieval Ethiopia. His topic for us today is Ethiopian monasticism in the Christian ecumene, the case of Abba Aragawi. So in the interest of fostering discussion, for those of you who were here for our last webinar, you know how this works. Each panelist will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. The panelists will then have a few minutes to ask each other questions or point to intersections in their work, after which we'll open the floor to questions from attendees. So as Suzanne mentioned, if you have a question you'd like to pose to a panelist, type it into the chat directed to everyone. The chat symbol is at the bottom of your screen, and indicate please to which panelist or panelists your question is directed, and then Aaron Butts and I will moderate the chat, reading your questions and relaying them to the panelists. So without further ado, I pass over the screen to our first speaker, Dr. Achi.